The horse was the ugliest animal Helen Graves had ever laid eyes on, and she raised her hand to bid on it anyway. The late autumn sun hung low over Durango, Colorado, casting long amber shadows across the livestock sale yard on the eastern edge of town. The year was 1882, and the town of Durango was still young enough to smell like fresh-cut timber and ambition. A railroad town that had clawed itself out of the San Juan Mountains only 2 years prior, drawing ranchers, miners, merchants, and drifters from every corner of the West. The sale yard itself was a sprawling affair of split-rail fencing and rough-sawn lumber, packed on this particular Saturday morning with ranchers in sweat-stained hats, cowboys leaning against fence posts with their arms crossed and their eyes appraising, and a scattering of townspeople who had come as much for the spectacle as the commerce. Helen stood near the back of the crowd, her dark wool coat buttoned to the throat despite the relative mildness of the day, her brown hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet that had seen better years. She was 32 years old, with steady gray eyes that people often mistook for coldness until they looked long enough to see the warmth underneath, and hands that were rougher than most women her age in Durango because she had been running a small homestead on her own for the better part of 18 months. Her husband, Thomas Graves, had died of a fever in the spring of 1881, leaving her with 40 acres of decent grazing land, a 2-room house that needed a new roof, and a bone-deep understanding that grief, however heavy, did not excuse a woman from the practical demands of staying alive. She had not come to the sale looking for a horse. She had come because her neighbor, old Chet Mallory, had told her there might be a serviceable draft animal she could use to get her winter hay in before the first serious snow. And the price of hiring a man with a team had gone up considerably now that the railroad was paying better wages than ranching. She had moved through the pens methodically, assessing each animal with the unsentimental eye of a woman who could not afford a mistake, and she had found 2 adequate draft horses at prices she could manage and 1 good saddle mare that was priced entirely beyond her means. And then she had seen the ugliest horse at the sale. He was penned alone at the far end of the yard, separated from the other animals as if by mutual agreement, and the first thing she noticed was that every other person who approached the fence to look at him turned away within a few seconds, some of them laughing. He was a large animal, standing perhaps 16 hands, built with the kind of heavy bone structure that suggested some draft ancestry, but his proportions were wrong in a way that was genuinely startling. His head was too large for his neck, broad and Roman-nosed and somehow doleful in expression, like a horse that had been told disappointing news every day of its life and had come to expect it. His coat was a muddy roan that could not quite decide whether it wanted to be brown or red, shot through with patches of white hair that had no symmetry to them whatsoever. One of his ears stood straight up in the manner of most horses, and the other flopped slightly sideways, giving him a permanently quizzical look. His mane had never been properly groomed and fell in matted ropes along his neck. He was, by any reasonable standard of equine beauty, a disaster. Helen stood at the fence and looked at him for a long time. He looked back at her. His eyes, she noticed, were dark and entirely calm, not the dull calm of a broken animal, but something quieter and more deliberate. He walked to the fence without being invited, and he put his enormous ugly head over the rail, and he exhaled a slow, warm breath that fogged briefly in the cool air, and he held completely still as she reached up and laid her palm against his jaw. Something passed between them that Helen could not have articulated to anyone who asked. She was not a fanciful woman. She did not believe in signs or portents or the mystical connections that some people claim to feel with animals. But she stood at that fence and felt, with the same quiet certainty with which she felt the cold or the weight of a full water bucket, that this horse was entirely trustworthy. Whatever he lacked in appearance, there was something in his stillness, in the way he had come to her without nervousness, in the calm darkness of his eyes, that told her he would not fail her. She went and found the auctioneer's assistant and asked about him. The man laughed. He said the horse had been brought down from the mountains by some trapper or scout type, a big fellow who had apparently decided to sell off a few animals before winter set in. The horse had no name on the bill of sale, just the designation Lot 47. The minimum bid was $4, which was an insult even by the standards of an ugly horse in 1882, and nobody had touched it. Helen found a spot near the rail when Lot 47 came through the ring, and she watched the auctioneer try to generate enthusiasm for what he called a substantial animal with good bone structure. And she heard the scattered laughter from the crowd, and she raised her hand at $4 and kept it raised until the gavel came down at $6.50, which represented very nearly the last of what she had intended to spend that day. She did not immediately notice the man standing at the far side of the ring, watching her. Clark Bishop noticed her the moment her hand went up. He was 38 years old and had been standing at the fence with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, watching the proceedings with the detached patience of a man who has spent a great deal of time alone and has learned to observe the world without requiring it to observe him back. He was large in the way that men who have spent years working in difficult country tend to be, not the exaggerated bulk of a man who lifts for show, but the functional, weathered solidity of someone whose body had been shaped by necessity rather than vanity. His beard was dark with threads of gray in it, his hands were scarred in several places, and his coat was the kind of heavy canvas and wool construction that mountain men favored, practical and unlovely, and built to last. He had brought 4 horses down from his winter camp in the San Juans to sell before the passes got truly dangerous, and 3 of them had sold well enough in the early part of the auction. The 4th was the roan, whom Clark had found wandering injured on a high ridge 2 years prior, and had taken in, and had nursed back to health, and had come to feel a complicated and genuine affection for, in the private way that solitary men sometimes feel things that they would never say aloud. He had put the horse in the sale not because he particularly wanted to sell him, but because the practical voice in the back of his head had pointed out that he could not keep feeding an animal that was too odd-looking to be useful in trade and too large to be economical over a hard winter. He had watched every person who came to the fence and looked at the horse turn away, and he had told himself this was fine, that the horse could winter with him, and he would try again in the spring, and he had been composing himself for this conclusion when a woman in a dark wool coat had walked up to the far fence and stood there for what seemed like a very long time. He watched her put her hand on the horse's jaw. He watched the horse go still for her, and then he watched her bid. He felt something shift in his chest that he was entirely unprepared for and could not immediately explain. It was not simply the surprise of seeing the horse sold. It was something about the quality of her attention as she had stood at the fence, the way she had not laughed, the way she had touched the horse not as a test but as an introduction. He had the sharp and inexplicable conviction that this woman had seen something in the animal that Clark himself had seen, and that the 2 of them were the only people in this entire sale yard who had looked at that ugly, ungainly, mismatched roan and understood what was actually there. He pushed through the crowd toward the exit gate where the buyer was expected to collect her purchase. Helen was there when he arrived, counting coins from a small leather purse into the auctioneer's assistant's palm with the careful deliberation of a woman for whom every dollar had weight. Clark stopped a few feet away and waited until the transaction was complete, and when the assistant handed her the lead rope and moved off, she turned and found him there. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes, direct and without apology. She was not the kind of woman who looked away first. "You brought him in," she said. It was not a question. She must have recognized him from across the ring. "Yes, ma'am," Clark said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, the way his voice always did when he had not spoken to another person in some time, which was most of the time. She looked at him steadily. "You want to tell me why you sold him?" "Practical reasons," he said, And were they good practical reasons? He considered this honestly. Probably not. She looked back at the horse, who had come to the fence of the holding pen where the assistant had put him, and was standing there with his large, ugly head angled toward her as if he had not yet lost track of her. She looked at the horse for a long moment and then looked back at Clark. "What do you see in him?" he asked. He had not planned to say it. It came out with a directness that surprised him, and he felt the back of his neck go warm, which was an experience he could not remember having since he was considerably younger. She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense she was deciding whether to give him a polite dismissal or an honest answer. "Steadiness," she said finally. "There is not a nervous bone in that animal. He came to the fence on his own. He stood still when I touched him. He looked at me the way a horse looks at you when it has decided you are trustworthy, and that kind of horse does not fail you." She paused. "I cannot afford a horse that fails me." Clark was quiet for a moment. He had spent 2 years with that roan and had never once put those observations into words, but every single one of them was accurate. "No," he said slowly, "he will not fail you." She looked at him with a new and slightly different quality of attention. "You know him well." "I found him hurt on a ridge above timberline about 2 years ago. Brought him down to my camp. He had taken a fall, I think, or something had spooked him badly. But he recovered without much fuss, and he has been the quietest animal I have ever owned." He paused. "I called him Drum." She tilted her head slightly. "Why Drum?" "Because of the sound his hooves make on hard ground. It is deeper than you expect. Like a drum beat." She was quiet for another moment, and then something happened to her face that was not quite a smile but was moving toward one, the way dawn moves toward morning without making any sudden announcement. "Drum," she said, as if tasting the word. "That is a good name." "He answers to it," Clark said, "most of the time." "My name is Helen Graves," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, her hand cold from the autumn air. "Clark Bishop, you are a trapper." "Among other things. I scout for the railroad occasionally. I hunt. I know the San Juans better than most, which is sometimes worth something to people." She nodded slowly. "How far up do you winter?" "Camp at about 9,000 feet, below the worst of the passes. It is rough in February but manageable." He looked at her. "You are ranching near here, 40 acres east of town," she said. "My husband passed 18 months ago. I have been managing alone since then." She said it plainly without asking for sympathy, which meant she was not looking for any. "I am sorry," he said anyway. "Thank you." She looked back at Drum. "He will need proper feed. He is thin." "He is always thin," Clark said. "He burns it faster than he takes it in. But he is healthy. His wind is good, his legs are sound. He just never holds condition the way a better-looking horse would." "I do not need him to look well," she said. "I need him to work." They stood for a moment in a silence that was, Clark noticed with some surprise, not uncomfortable. The sale yard moved around them, men shouting bids, horses moving through the ring, the smell of livestock and sawdust and autumn air, and the two of them stood at the holding pen fence in a quiet that felt strangely private. "I have a wagon," she said. "I can walk him out behind it without trouble." "I will help you load him," Clark said. She looked at him briefly. "You do not have to." "No," he agreed, "but I would like to see him settled before I head back up." She considered this for a moment, and then nodded, which he understood was not a small thing for a woman who was clearly accustomed to managing on her own. It took them the better part of an hour to get Drum loaded, primarily because Drum was not opposed to the wagon but felt strongly that the process should not be rushed. And he stood outside the loading ramp for several minutes simply looking at it with his quizzical lopsided-eared expression, until Helen walked up beside him and spoke to him quietly, and he walked on without further deliberation. Clark watched this and felt the thing in his chest shift again. He helped her secure Drum to the back of the wagon, and she climbed to the seat and gathered the reins of her draft horse, a reliable-looking gray, and she looked down at Clark and said, "Thank you for the help, Mr. Bishop." "Clark," he said. She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Clark," she said, "thank you." He stood in the sale yard and watched her wagon move down the road toward the eastern edge of town, until the dust settled back and she was gone, and he stood there longer than made any practical sense, thinking about steady gray eyes and a horse that had gone to the fence on its own, and the particular quality of a person who could look at something ugly and understand what was true about it. He went to the saloon and had a whiskey and sat at the bar, and told himself he had said everything that needed saying and done everything that needed doing, and that the sensible course of action was to collect his remaining money from the auction house, ride back up toward his mountain camp, and prepare for winter. He sat at the bar for a long time and did not move, and eventually the barkeep, a blunt man named Harlan who had seen most varieties of human distraction, set another whiskey in front of him without being asked and said, "Who was she?" Clark looked up. "I do not know what you mean." Harlan looked at him with the patient skepticism of a man in his profession. "Son, you have been sitting here staring at the wall for 40 minutes. Clark looked at his whiskey. "A widow," he said. "She bought a horse," said Harlan, and moved away to serve someone else. Clark did not go back up to his mountain camp that afternoon. He told himself he needed to pick up supplies before the hardware store closed, which was true enough, and he spent an hour buying flour and salt and ammunition and lamp oil, and then he found himself at the livery stable asking old Potts, who kept the horses for sale boarders, whether he happened to know a woman named Graves who had 40 acres east of town. Potts knew everybody. He described the place: the road east from town past the feed mill, then south 2 miles on a dirt track, a 2-room house with a barn that needed attention, and a field that had good grass on it if she could get it tended properly. Clark rode out there the following morning. He told himself this was because he was going to be in the area anyway, which was not true in any meaningful sense. He told himself he had forgotten to tell her something about Drum's care, which was partially true because there was one thing he had meant to mention about the horse's tendency to crib on fence posts in winter if he got bored. He told himself both these things without fully believing either of them, and he rode east from Durango in the early morning light, with the mountains rising behind him in their great blue and white permanence, and he felt, for the first time in several years, that he was moving toward something rather than away from it. He found the place exactly as Potts had described it. The house was small but solid, the barn more ramshackle than he liked the look of, and there were signs of careful maintenance everywhere. A yard swept clean, firewood split and stacked with geometric precision, kitchen garden put to bed neatly for the winter. The kind of order that spoke of a person who was holding things together by will and discipline rather than ease. He found Helen in the barn, standing in the stall with Drum, watching the horse eat hay with a satisfied expression. She heard Clark's footsteps and turned without startlement, which told him her senses were good. "I forgot to mention something about him," Clark said. He felt the insufficiency of this explanation even as he spoke it. She looked at him with that steady gaze. "About the cribbing," she said. He blinked. "You know about it. I looked at his teeth yesterday evening. I have seen cribbing wear before." She studied him for a moment with an expression that he thought might be somewhere between amusement and curiosity. "You rode 2 miles to tell me about the cribbing." "Yes," he said. A pause stretched between them, longer than either of them attempted to fill. "The coffee is on," she said finally. It was the best thing he had heard in a considerable time. They sat at her kitchen table, which was small and plain and clean as everything else in her house, and drank coffee from heavy ceramic cups, and the conversation moved with a naturalness that Clark had not experienced in a very long time. He had spent so many years in the mountains, in the particular solitude of a man who prefers the company of high country to the complications of towns, that he had half convinced himself he had forgotten how to talk to people. But talking to Helen was not like talking to people. It was like talking to someone who was actually listening, which was different. She told him about the homestead, about Thomas, about the 1.5 years she had been managing it alone. She spoke about Thomas with the matter-of-fact grief of someone who has processed the worst of their loss, and arrived at a place of clear-eyed memory, the way a scar speaks of injury without still being the injury. He had been a good man, she said, a practical man who had not been given to great romantic gestures but had been reliable in all the ways that mattered. She missed him as she missed a hand that was no longer there. Clark told her about the mountains, about the years he had spent scouting and trapping and learning the country, about his family in Missouri that he had not seen in 12 years. He had a brother there who had a wheat farm and wrote letters twice a year, and Clark wrote back with less frequency, and they existed in a relationship of mutual goodwill and geographic incomprehension. He told her about finding Drum, about the long cold weeks he had spent bringing the horse back from a serious injury, about the strange affection he had developed for an animal that had no commercial value and made people laugh. He told her this with a self-consciousness that was new to him, watching her face as he spoke, looking for the dismissal or condescension that he half expected, and finding instead a quiet attention that made him want to keep talking. "You miss him already," she said. She was not accusing him of anything. "I did not think I would," he said honestly. "It is just a horse." She looked at him across the table with something direct and kind. "It is not just a horse." He looked down at his coffee cup. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not." They talked for 2 hours, which neither of them counted, and when Clark finally stood to go, the autumn light had moved well past mid-morning, and the mountains were bright and clear against the blue sky. He stood in the doorway and she stood in the yard, and he looked at her in her worn coat with her hair coming loose from its pins in the wind, and felt the full weight of what he was about to do, which was to ride away and go back up to his camp and let the winter close in around him the way it always did. "I will be in town again next month," he said. It came out more deliberate than he intended. She looked at him. "The hardware store carries everything you need." "Mostly," he said, and then, because she was clearly not a woman who responded well to indirection, "I would like to call again if that is acceptable." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her consider it, not coyly but genuinely, the way she did everything, with a seriousness that treated him as someone worth the consideration. "Yes," she said, "that is acceptable." He rode back toward Durango with the mountains behind him, and a feeling in his chest that he did not have a name for but recognized, distantly, as happiness. The month between visits was the longest Clark could remember spending in his mountain camp, which was saying something given that he had wintered alone there through some considerable hardships. He went about his routines, the trapping lines and the firewood cutting and the small repairs that kept his camp functional through the snow, and he did all of it with half his mind somewhere else, which was an experience he had entirely forgotten was possible. He thought about her hands on Drum's jaw. He thought about the way she said his horse's name, as if she were taking it seriously. He thought about how she had invited him in for coffee, not as a social performance, but as a plain and generous act, the way she did everything, directly and without embellishment. He thought about the barn that needed attention, and about how she was managing 40 acres alone, and about the winter that was coming on fast now, the peaks above his camp going white in October and the temperature dropping at night to places that made a man thoughtful about shelter and heat and the general fragility of things. He came down from the mountain in November, a week earlier than he had planned, with a string of furs and a packload of things he needed, and also in the bottom of his pack, a piece of carved wood he had made during a stretch of cold nights when the wind was up and his hands needed occupation. He had not intended to carve anything in particular, but the piece of pine had been in his hand and the knife had moved, and after several evenings he had a small and imperfect horse, disproportionate in the exact way that Drum was disproportionate, with a head that was too large and an ear that fell slightly sideways. He looked at it for a long time before he packed it. He went to town first, sold his furs at Hanson's trading post, picked up his supplies at the hardware store, and then rode east on the road toward Helen's homestead, and he felt the nervous energy of it in a way he had not felt anything since he was a young man, and everything was new. She was in the yard when he arrived, splitting wood with a competence and rhythm that told him she had been doing it for a long time. She saw him coming and set the axe in the block and waited, wiping her hands on her coat, and her expression when he rode up was quietly pleased, which was better than he had allowed himself to expect. They talked in the yard for a while, and then she brought him inside, and there was coffee again, and the warmth of the small kitchen, and the conversation picked up from where it had left off with the ease of people who have been thinking about each other's company in the intervening time. He noticed things about her house that he had not noticed before: the shelf of books above the fireplace, the careful mending on the curtains at the window, the small framed photograph on the mantelpiece that was certainly Thomas Graves, a solid-looking man in his 30s who had kind eyes and a serious expression. He looked at the photograph without concealment, and she saw him looking. "He was a good man," she said again in the same tone as before. "He looks it," Clark said. She looked at him with that directness. "I have been thinking about what you said about the practical reasons for selling drum. They were not good practical reasons." He considered this. "No," he admitted. "What were they really?" He was quiet for a moment. This was the kind of question that required honesty, and honesty required a kind of self-knowledge that he had let go somewhat rusty. "I think I was afraid of caring too much about something I could not keep with me all the time," he said slowly. "The camp is not easy in winter. If he had been hurt or sick and I could not get down to a town, I could not have managed it well." She listened to this carefully. "That is not an entirely impractical reason. No, but it was also partly the other thing." She looked at him steadily and said nothing, which was how she let him know she was still listening. "It is easier," he said, "to be alone in a way that does not cost you anything." She was quiet for a long time after that. The fire popped in the hearth, and the wind moved against the windows, and outside Drum was visible through the small kitchen window, standing in the corral with his big ugly head over the fence rail and his crooked ear angled toward the house as if he were trying to hear the conversation. "Yes," she said finally, "it is easier." He looked at her. "But you did not choose it." "I did not get the choice," she said. "Thomas died and left me here, and easier was not available." "You had the choice, and you went up the mountain anyway." She said it without judgment. "I sometimes think the hardest thing about grief is not the grief itself. It is the moment when you realize the grief is going to end eventually, and you have to decide what to do with that." Clark felt something in his chest settle, the way a stone settles to the bottom of a clear pool, and he understood that this was one of the truest things anyone had said to him in a very long time. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and put the carved horse on the table between them. It was rough and imperfect, and the ear was wrong, but it was unmistakably Drum. She looked at it for a long moment without picking it up. Then she picked it up and held it in both hands and turned it slowly, looking at every angle of it, and she did not say anything for what felt like a full minute. "You made this," she said. "During a long stretch of cold nights," he said. "My hands needed something to do." She looked at him across the table with an expression that had gone quiet and deep, the way water goes deep far from shore. "It is the most thoughtful gift I have received in several years," she said. And then, with the direct simplicity that he was learning, was simply how she said important things. "Thank you, Clark." It was the second time she had used his first name, and it hit him with the same unexpected force as the first time. He came back 3 more times before December, each visit longer than the last, and each one changed something between them in a way that could not be changed back, the slow and irreversible accumulation of a person becoming known to another person. He met her neighbors, the Mallorys, Chet and his wife Ada, a decent older couple who watched Clark with the careful appraisal of people who felt a proprietary interest in Helen's welfare. He fixed the loose boards in the barn that had been bothering him since his first visit, not as an announcement, but because they were loose and he had the tools. He helped her get the last of the winter hay stacked properly in the loft. He brought down a side of elk he had taken in October, and she smoked it, and they ate it for supper on a cold November evening that turned into the first real snowfall of the season. the flakes coming down soft and silent outside the window while the fire burned, and the lamp light held the small kitchen in a warm pool. He did not kiss her that evening. He wanted to, with a clarity that surprised him in its force, but he was aware that she was a widow who was still finding the shape of herself without Thomas, and he was a man who had spent years being careless with his own heart and had not previously understood the value of being careful. He said good night and went out into the new snow and rode back toward town, where he had taken a room at the boarding house for the season. She watched him go from the porch, and she stood there after he was gone, in the falling snow, with her hands in her coat pockets, and a feeling in her chest that was new and warm and also frightening, because she had not felt this particular feeling since she was a young woman meeting Thomas for the first time, and had not expected to feel it again. She went inside and looked at the carved horse on the mantelpiece next to Thomas's photograph, and she spoke to Thomas in the private way she sometimes did when things were complicated, and she told him she thought there was something happening that she needed to decide about. She told him she was not forgetting him. She told him that love, the actual living in the world kind, was apparently not a thing with a fixed amount, and that she had discovered this in a way she had not anticipated. The wind was up that night, and the snow came down heavy on the mountains, and somewhere above timberline Clark Bishop was riding toward his boarding house room and thinking about a woman with gray eyes who spoke the truth without drama and had looked at an ugly horse and understood what was true about it. In December, two things happened that changed the pace of everything. The first was that Drum went lame. It was nothing serious, a stone bruise on his right front hoof from the frozen ground that Helen had caught early because she checked him every morning, but it meant he needed rest and careful attention. She had been relying on him more than she had realized, for the small daily work of the homestead, and his lameness threw her routine into disarray at exactly the wrong time of year, when the snow was coming and the work was heaviest. She sent word to Clark through Chet Mallory, who went into town on Thursdays, and Clark arrived the following morning on his big bay horse with a pack of supplies, and the kind of practical knowledge about equine injury that came from years in the mountains where there was no veterinarian available, and a horse's soundness was a matter of life and death. He examined Drum's hoof with careful hands while Helen held the horse's halter, and he explained what needed to be done, a poultice and rest, and a change to his bedding to keep the foot clean. He spoke quietly to Drum while he worked, the same tone he had used at the sale yard, and Drum stood with his characteristic stillness and his crooked ear angled toward Clark's voice. "He knows you," Helen said. "We spent 2 years together," Clark said, not looking up from the hoof. "He knows me about as well as anything does." She looked at the crown of his dark hat and the breadth of his shoulders, and the careful, gentle way his hands moved around the injury, and she thought about what it meant that this was the man she found herself thinking about in the evenings after the work was done. Not with the aching loss with which she had thought about Thomas in the first year of his absence, but with a different quality of longing, forward-facing rather than backward, curious rather than grief-struck. "Clark," she said. He looked up. She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything, without flinching from what she was about to say. "I would like to know what your intentions are," she said. "I am not asking to rush anything. I am asking because I am a practical woman, and I find it useful to know what I am dealing with." He held her gaze. Drum moved his weight slightly, and Clark steadied him without looking away from her. The barn was quiet around them, the horses breathing and shifting in the winter cold, the smell of hay and horses and the particular stillness of a closed space in deep winter. "My intentions," he said slowly, "are serious." She nodded once, taking this in. "I did not plan for this," he said. "I came to the sale to sell horses and go back up the mountain and be left alone, which is what I have been doing for a long time. And then you bid on the ugliest horse at the sale and you knew what you were doing, and I could not make myself go back up and be left alone in the same way as before." He paused. I am telling you this because you asked me directly and you deserve a direct answer, and also because I am not, as it turns out, a man who knows how to be subtle about things that matter." She was quiet for a moment. "How long would you stay down from the mountain?" "I have been thinking about that," he said. "A man can scout and guide and do a reasonable amount of work from lower country than 9,000 feet. The railroad is growing south and west of here. There are people who need guides and surveyors, escorts and supply runs, and most of that work is in the lower ranges." He paused again. "I am not saying I would stop going into the mountains. The mountains are part of what I am. But I have been thinking about what it would mean to come down further than I usually do, and I find I am not opposed to it." She looked at him for a long time. "That is a large thing to consider on account of a horse auction," she said, and her voice had the dry quality that he had learned was as close to teasing as she came. Something in him unlocked at the sound of it. He felt the corner of his mouth pulled toward a smile, which was an event he was apparently still capable of even though he had not been performing it much lately. "On account of more than the horse auction," he said. She smiled then fully for the first time he had seen, and it was not the polite social smile of a woman meeting a stranger but the real one, the one that changed the whole landscape of her face and turned it suddenly and utterly beautiful. He felt that smile like a physical thing, like stepping from shadow into sunlight. "Finish the poultice," she said, "and then come inside and tell me more about these thoughts of yours." He finished the poultice. He came inside. And the conversation that followed was the most important he had had in 38 years of life, because it was the conversation where two people who had been careful with themselves for different reasons decided, quietly and with mutual deliberation, that they were going to stop being quite so careful. He did not kiss her that evening either. But at the door he took her hand and held it for a moment, and she let him, and the cold December air moved between them, and the stars were hard and bright above the mountains, and he looked at her in the lamplight from the door and said, "I will come back in a week." "I know you will," she said. The week was 7 days of slow, complicated internal work for both of them, which neither of them knew about in detail because they were spending it separately. Clark in his boarding house room writing a long letter to his brother in Missouri that he kept starting over. Helen in her house looking at the carved horse on the mantelpiece and having private conversations with Thomas's photograph that were less apologetic than the ones before. She had loved Thomas. She was certain of this and did not need to diminish it or explain it away. Thomas had been her first love and her partner and her husband, and she had missed him with a physical completeness that she had never fully described to anyone. But Thomas had been gone for 18 months now, and the homestead had continued, and she had continued, and the person who was continuing was not the same person who had buried him, because grief changes people even when they do not notice it happening. She was 32 years old, and she had 40 acres and a lame horse and a barn that needed work and a winter ahead, and a life that was not finished, not remotely. And the mountain man who had made a rough carving of his ugly horse and brought it across 2 miles of cold road because his hands had needed something to do during cold nights was, she had concluded with the same clear-eyed practicality with which she assessed everything, a person worth the risk. When Clark came back in a week, she was ready. He came in the late afternoon with the light going golden and cold across the snow, and she met him at the gate with her coat buttoned and her boots on, and the direct look in her eye that he had come to understand meant she had decided something and was prepared to say it. She said, "I want to be straightforward with you." He stopped at the gate and waited. "I am falling in love with you," she said. "I did not intend to, and I was not looking for it. And I am telling you because I am not a woman who knows how to go around things when going straight at them is available." He stood in the snow and looked at her and felt the full weight of what she had just said settle over him like warmth, like the first fire after a long, cold ride. He had rehearsed a great many things to say to her during the past week, and every one of them dissolved, and what came out instead was the simple, unadorned truth. "I have been in love with you since you put your hand on that horse's face," he said. I did not know what to do with it then, and I am still figuring out what to do with it, but I am certain of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the yard and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the color in her cheeks from the cold and the slight uncertainty in her eyes that was present even behind all that steadiness, the evidence that this cost her something to say, which made it worth more. He put his hands on either side of her face, careful as he was with anything that mattered, and kissed her. She kissed him back. The snow was blue in the fading light, and the mountains rose above them in their ancient indifference to human affairs, and the horses moved in the corral behind the barn, and neither of them noticed any of it. When they stepped back from each other, her cheeks were very red and his hands were still in the air between them, suspended, as if they had not quite gotten the news that the moment was over. "Well," she said, a little breathlessly, which was the most undone he had ever heard her sound. "Well," he agreed. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised out of her, not the careful kind, and it was so unexpected and so warm that he felt it in the center of his chest and knew, with the same certainty with which he knew the mountains and the weather and all the other things he had learned to read in 38 years, that this was it. This was the thing he had spent years not admitting he was looking for. The rest of the winter moved differently than either of them had lived through before. Clark stayed in Durango, taking work where he could find it, doing a supply run for the railroad surveyors in January and guiding a mining company agent through the lower ranges in February. He came to the homestead several times a week, and they worked alongside each other in the practical way of people who understand that love is not only conversation, but also action. The two of them fixing the barn roof in sections as the weather permitted, working on the fencing on the east pasture, managing Drum's recovery and eventual return to soundness. Drum recovered fully by February, his hoof healed clean under Helen's careful attention, and the morning she put him in the corral and watched him move sound and free. She said nothing, but her face held a quiet satisfaction that Clark watched from the barn doorway and felt as his own. Chet Mallory approved of Clark in the particular way of an older man who reserves full judgment until he has seen how a younger man works, and one cold afternoon when they were mending fence together along the property line, Chet said, without preamble, "She is a good woman, better than most." "Yes," Clark said. "She will not be managed," Chet said. "You need to understand that up front. She makes her own decisions and she makes them well." "I know," Clark said. "Good," said Chet, and they went back to mending fence. Ada Mallory was warmer in her approval and less indirect about expressing it. She came to Helen's house for tea in January and said simply, "He looks at you the way a man should look at a woman, which is like he cannot entirely believe his luck." Helen had colored and changed the subject, but afterward, alone, she had thought about it with a private pleasure that was new and good. In March, when the mountain passes were beginning to open and Clark was making plans for his spring work, he sat down with Helen at the kitchen table and had the conversation that had been building between them through the whole of the winter. He said, "I do not want to go back up the mountain and leave this." She said, "I know." He said, "I have been thinking about a different kind of life than the one I have been living, a life that is still in this country because this country is what I know and what I am, but lower, with work that keeps me in the valley most of the year. I have spoken to the railroad about a permanent position guiding survey parties in the lower ranges. It would be steady work, not lavish, but sufficient." She listened carefully and said nothing until he was finished. "I have 40 acres, she said, "that need more than one person to work them properly. The east pasture could carry more cattle than I have been running if the fencing were completed. The barn, now that the roof is sound, could take additional horses." She looked at him. "I am not asking you to give up what you are. I am asking whether what you are could coexist with what I am trying to build here." He looked at her across the table and thought about the mountain camp, the silence of it, the absolute freedom of a life that answered to no one, and he held that image honestly and found that what he felt about it was not loss but a kind of grateful farewell, the way you say goodbye to a thing you valued but have outgrown. It could, he said, more than coexist. She looked at him with those steady eyes, and then she said, very quietly, "Clark, will you marry me?" He stared at her. She had the faintest trace of color in her cheeks, and her hands were folded on the table, and she was looking at him with the full force of her directness, which was considerable, and underneath it the vulnerability of someone who has said the most important thing and is waiting. "Yes," he said immediately. And then, because she had done the courageous thing and he ought to meet it, "I have been working up to asking you for 2 months." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "You were taking a great deal of time about it." He laughed, which was still something that surprised him when it happened, this easy laughter that she brought out of him. "I will note," he said, "that you have now beaten me to the proposal, and I will have to live with the fact of that." "I expect you will manage," she said, and her voice had the dry warmth in it that he loved. They were married in April, in the small white church on the north end of Durango's Main Street, in a ceremony attended by Chet and Ada Mallory, the boarding house proprietress Mrs. Park, who had been quietly charmed by Clark all winter, the railroad survey chief named Alderman, who had become Clark's primary employer, and a scattering of townspeople who had heard the story of the horse auction and found it satisfyingly romantic. Helen wore a dress she had made herself from good gray wool, which was not a wedding gown in any elaborate sense but which fit her perfectly and suited her entirely. And Clark wore his best coat and a clean shirt and had shaved with more care than usual. And when they stood at the front of the church and the minister said the words, Clark looked at Helen's face and felt the particular solemnity of a moment that you know, while you are in it, that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. She looked back at him with those clear eyes and said her vows in a steady voice that did not tremble, which was entirely Helen, and he said his with a gravity that matched them. Chet Mallory cried quietly in the second pew, which Ada pretended not to notice. They rode back to the homestead together that evening, the two of them on horseback, because Helen had decided a wagon was insufficiently celebratory for the occasion, and Drum was among the horses in the corral when they arrived, his large head over the fence rail and his crooked ear angled toward them. And Helen laughed when she saw him, and Clark felt the evening go gold around them, and thought that this was what home was, not a place necessarily, but a configuration of things that together meant you had arrived. The spring and summer that followed were the fullest of Clark's life, and Helen would say later, the fullest of hers since before Thomas's illness. They worked the homestead together in the complementary way of two people whose skills happened to fit well against each other. Clark's knowledge of the land and animals and practical construction fitting naturally alongside Helen's organizational rigor, and her profound unwillingness to let any task remain half done. The east pasture fencing was completed in May, and they brought in 6 additional cattle in June from a rancher east of town who was scaling back. The barn got new stall partitions and a proper tack room. The house got its long-needed new roof, and Clark added a porch along the south side that caught the afternoon sun, where they took to sitting in the evenings when the work was done. Clark did his railroad survey work through the spring and early summer, gone for stretches of 3 or 4 days at a time, and Helen managed the homestead in his absence with the same competence she had always managed it. But when he came back, there was the new particular satisfaction of returning to a place where someone was waiting for you with that directness and that warmth, and the evenings on the porch were the best part of every trip home. In the summer, Durango was growing fast, as Western railroad towns did in those years, filling with new people and new buildings and new complications, and Clark and Helen watched it from their slight remove of 2 miles east of town, with the dual perspective of people who were glad to have a town nearby and glad not to be entirely in it. They went in on Saturdays for supplies and conversation, and Clark was welcomed into the fabric of the community with the gradual, provisional acceptance of a town for someone who came from outside it and had proved to be useful and decent. There were difficulties, as there were in any life. A drought in July that dried the creek to half its usual flow and required careful management of the water for the animals. A disagreement with a neighboring rancher named Prentice over a shared property line, which was resolved after considerable unpleasantness by a survey that confirmed Helen's position, and which left Prentice chastened and Clark more aware than ever of his wife's capacity for calm, righteous stubbornness. A late summer injury to one of the draft horses that cost them a significant week of haying work and required Clark to hire on a town boy named Sam Vickers to help with the hay, which they managed but not without strain. Sam Vickers was 17 and apparently had never seen a horse like Drum in his life, and said so with considerable enthusiasm and no social tact the first time he laid eyes on him. Clark watched Helen listen to the boy's inventory of Drum's physical peculiarities with the particular patience of someone who has heard this before and has arrived at a position of serenity about it. He is, Helen agreed pleasantly, not a conventionally attractive animal. He is, however, the best-tempered, steadiest, and most reliable horse I have ever owned, and I would not trade him for any 3 horses you could show me. Sam Vickers looked at Drum again with a recalibrated expression. Is he fast? He is not fast, Helen said. He is consistent. He goes all day and arrives in the same condition he left in, and when you ask him to do something he does it. There are people, she added mildly, looking at Sam in a way that suggested the applicability of the comparison was not accidental, who could stand to be more like Drum. Sam Vickers worked hard the rest of the week. Clark told Helen that evening on the porch that she had handled the boy masterfully, and she said she had simply said what was true, which was her standard answer for most things. In September, Helen told Clark she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen over breakfast, in her characteristic direct manner, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession that she found, privately, among the most charming things she had ever witnessed in a human being. There was surprise, which she had expected, and then something that was unmistakably joy, so uncomplicated and immediate that it transformed his face entirely, and then a solemnity that settled over the joy without displacing it, the expression of a man who has just understood that something permanent has happened. He reached across the table and took both her hands, not speaking for a moment. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling entirely well," she said, "and also somewhat tired in the mornings, which I understand is normal and which I intend to manage like any other inconvenience." He looked at her with a helpless expression that was itself a kind of communication. "You are extraordinary," he said. She colored slightly. "I am simply telling you information." "Helen," he said, "you told me you were having a baby the way you would tell me the fence needed mending." "The fence also needs mending," she said. "But yes, we are having a baby." He stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her very carefully, as if she had suddenly become fragile, which she had not and did not intend to be. But she let him hold her because the feeling of his arms around her was one of the things she had decided to allow herself, the straightforward comfort of being held by someone who loved her, without making herself account for it or explain it. He spoke quietly against her hair. "I did not think I would have this." She understood what he meant without his needing to elaborate. She had not thought she would have it again either. The pregnancy proceeded well through the autumn. Helen continued to work the homestead with appropriate modifications, and Clark was home more often, having structured his survey work to allow for it, and they moved through the season with the focused energy of people preparing for something large. The second bedroom of the house was cleaned and aired and fitted with a small wooden bed that Clark built himself over several weeks of careful effort, the joints tight and the wood sanded smooth, and Helen watched it take shape with an expression that she did not entirely succeed in keeping composed. Winter came in earnest in November, a hard one in 1883, with heavy snow and sustained cold that kept them close to the homestead through long dark stretches. It was a different kind of winter than either of them had ever had before, not solitary, not lonely, but inward and warm, the two of them in the small house with the fire and the books, and the conversations that had deepened through the year into something that neither of them could imagine doing without. They talked about everything. They talked about the mountains and the land and the way the West was changing, the railroad drawing more people every season, towns growing where there had been nothing, the old ways of moving through the country giving way to new ones. Clark talked about what he had seen in his years of scouting, the landscape and the wildlife, and the changing of the seasons at altitude, things he had never had anyone to tell. And Helen listened with the focused attention that was one of her gifts, and asked questions that showed she had actually heard what he said. She told him about her life before Thomas, about growing up in Ohio in a family that had treated practical competence in women as a virtue rather than an oddity, which had shaped her into someone who found incompetence more uncomfortable than hardship. She told him about the night Thomas had died, which she had never told anyone fully, and Clark listened without interruption and without trying to make it easier, which was what she needed, someone to hold the weight of it with her rather than trying to take it away. He told her about a winter 12 years before, alone in the mountains in a storm that had lasted 3 weeks, and the particular quality of that solitude, the way it had stripped him of everything unnecessary and left him with a clarity about what he was and what he could endure, but also with a kind of loneliness that had settled into him like cold into stone, gradual and deep. He had never fully shaken it until this year. She listened to this, and then she reached across and put her hand on his. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Their son was born in March of 1884, in the house on the homestead, with the help of a doctor named Whitmore who rode out from Durango in the early morning hours through a late-season snowfall, and Ada Mallory, who had been a mother 5 times and was the most practically useful person either of them could have wished for. It was a hard labor and a long one, and Clark spent 8 hours in a state of contained anxiety that he managed only by being as useful as possible and staying out of the way, when being useful was not an option. He sat on the porch in the cold and listened to the sounds of the house and the mountains and tried to breathe steadily, and at one point Mallory came out and sat beside him without speaking, and they watched the dawn come up over the eastern plain in silence, which was a considerable kindness. At 7:30 in the morning, Ada opened the door and looked out at Clark with a face that told him what he needed to know before she said it. "You have a son," she said. "Mother and child are both well." He went inside, and there was Helen in the bed, exhausted and clear-eyed, holding a small wrapped bundle with the careful certainty of a woman who has decided to be competent at this too. And she looked up at him when he came through the door with an expression that contained everything: the exhaustion and the relief and the love and the particular wonder of a person who has just done something enormous. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very new and very red and had, he noticed with a private joy, his mother's gray eyes, or at least the promise of them. "He is healthy?" he asked, because this was the first thing. "He is healthy," Helen said. "He is loud and healthy and entirely opinionated, which I think he comes by honestly from both sides." Clark looked at her face, worn and beautiful and deeply, fundamentally happy, and he felt the full measure of what he had, which was more than he had ever known how to want. "What shall we call him?" he asked. She had thought about this. "James," she said, "after your brother, if that is acceptable." He looked at her. He had mentioned his brother in a handful of conversations during the winter, the distant relationship, the letters, the 12 years, and he had not expected her to have stored this particular detail or to offer it now in this way. "Yes," he said, and his voice was rough. "That is very acceptable. James Thomas Bishop came into the world on the 14th of March, 1884, in a 2-room house on 40 acres east of Durango, Colorado, and filled the place in the way that small new lives do, with noise and need and an extraordinary concentrated vitality that reorganized everything around him." Clark wrote to his brother in Missouri a long letter that he actually sent. telling him about Helen and James, and the homestead and the life he had found in the San Juan country. And his brother wrote back within the month with a warmth and a vividness that told Clark the distance had not done what he had assumed it had done to that relationship. They began to write more frequently, and the following year his brother's family made the journey west to Durango for a visit that lasted 2 weeks, which was the occasion for more family than Clark had been in the same room with in over a decade, and which Helen managed with the serene organizational capacity that he had by now come to regard as one of her defining gifts. His brother Jacob was a broad-shouldered man with Clark's coloring, and none of Clark's preference for solitude. An expansive, warm-spoken man who took immediately to Helen and told Clark on the 3rd day of the visit, when they were mending fence together in the east pasture, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, which Clark agreed with without reservation. His brother's wife, Nora, was a woman of approximately Helen's age and a great deal of the same directness, and the two women found each other with the particular velocity of people who recognize a kindred mind, and by the end of the first week were deep in conversations about the practical matters of Western homesteading versus Midwestern farming that continued through the evenings after supper and went long into the night. The homestead had grown by the time of Jacob's visit. The cattle herd was up to 14 head. The east pasture was fully fenced and productive. There was a new tool shed and a root cellar that Clark had built through the previous autumn, and Helen had put in a proper kitchen garden and a small orchard of apple saplings that would not bear for several years, but that she had planted with the characteristic long-term thinking of a woman who understood that the best time to plant trees was when you intended to stay. Drum was 5 years old now, still the ugliest horse in Durango County, still the most trustworthy. His ear still flopped sideways. His coat was still the muddy, indecisive roan. His head was still too large for his neck. But he moved sound and free in the pasture, and he came to Helen over the fence every morning, and he was, as she had said at the start, everything she had needed him to be. James was a year old and walking, or attempting to walk, with the unsteady determination of a child who has decided that crawling is beneath his dignity, even though his legs are not yet reliably cooperating. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and a personality that seemed, even at this early age, to partake of both of them in equal measure, the directness and the observation and the steady attention to things. Clark watched his son attempt to cross the kitchen floor on his own one morning in April, while Helen sat at the table with her second cup of coffee, and watched with the same alert patience she brought to everything. And he thought about a sale yard in October of 1882, and an ugly horse and a woman he had not known yet, and the improbable sequence of things that had brought him here to this kitchen with this family. He thought about the way she had put her hand on Drum's jaw, and understood something true about an animal that nobody else had looked at with enough patience to understand. He thought about how that was precisely the quality he had fallen in love with before he knew he was falling, the capacity to look past the surfaces of things to what was actually there. He thought about the carved horse, which still sat on the mantelpiece, which she had never moved, even when they had rearranged the mantel to accommodate the addition of James's early items, a small painted block, a tin cup with his name scratched into it by Ada Mallory as a birth gift. He thought about all the cold nights he had spent in his mountain camp, and the way the distance between that life and this one was as great as any mountain distance he had crossed, and how he had crossed it at a livestock sale in Durango because a woman in a dark wool coat had done the one thing nobody else had done, which was to stop and look. "What are you thinking about?" Helen asked. She had been watching him from the table, which she could do without his noticing because she was quiet, and because he had a tendency to get lost in his own thoughts on weekend mornings. He looked at her. She was wearing her everyday dress with her hair loose because it was early and James had not yet required the full armor of the day, and there was a smudge of flour on her collarbone from the biscuits she had made at dawn, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Sale yard, he said. She raised an eyebrow slightly. 1882. Yes. She looked at him for a moment with that steady warmth. Thinking that you nearly went back up the mountain. Thinking that you raised your hand on lot 47 when nobody else would. He was worth raising a hand for, she said simply. Yes, Clark said. He looked at James, who had succeeded in covering approximately half the kitchen floor, and was engaged in earnest negotiation with a table leg that had gotten in his way. He was worth raising a hand for, he agreed, understanding that they were not talking about the same thing anymore, but that this was entirely appropriate. James Bishop, thwarted by the table leg but unwilling to yield to it, planted his hands on the floor and looked up at both of his parents with an expression of profound determination, and then got up and went around it, and made the rest of the way across the floor on his own 2 feet. Helen met Clark's eyes. She was not a woman who cried easily, but there was something bright in her expression, the unguarded kind of joy that surprises itself. He stood up and went to the table and sat across from her and took her hands in both of his, the rough hands that had carved a small, ugly horse during cold mountain nights, holding her capable, work-roughed hands, and they sat together at the kitchen table while their son found his feet for the first time, and the spring light came through the window clean and yellow and new. In the years that followed, the homestead continued to grow and to settle into itself, the way land and buildings do when the people on them are committed to staying. The orchard Helen had planted came into bearing in 1887, and the first season of apples was a small one, but sufficient to make preserves, and enough apple butter to last through the winter with some to give to the Mallorys, who received it with the satisfaction of people watching a long-term investment pay off. The cattle herd grew to 20 head. Clark built a proper addition to the house in the summer of 1886, extending the south side to include a second proper bedroom and a sitting room, and the porch remained because both of them had decided it was irreplaceable. James grew into a sturdy, observant child who shared his mother's directness and his father's capacity for quiet, and who, by the age of 3, had developed an intense relationship with Drum that involved a great deal of time at the fence rail, and an insistence on being allowed to brush the horse's mane, which Drum permitted with his characteristic patience while looking vaguely skeptical. In the fall of 1886, Helen told Clark she was expecting again, and this time his face went through the sequence of expressions faster, the surprise overlapping the joy almost instantaneously, and he laughed when she told him, which was not the response she had expected but was thoroughly the right one. Again, he said. Yes, she said, again. I am, he said, enormously pleased. I noticed, she said in the dry, warm voice that still made him laugh. Their daughter arrived in April of 1887 in the new bedroom of the expanded house with Dr. Whitmore again and Ada Mallory again, and this time Clark was better prepared for the waiting, though no less anxious. She arrived in the early evening before full dark, and came into the world with a voice that announced her presence without ambiguity, which Ada said was an excellent sign, and Clark believed completely. They called her Clara, which was Helen's idea, and which Clark received with a silence that she read correctly as moved beyond ready speech. Clara had her father's dark hair and her mother's steady eyes, and from the earliest weeks, a personality that partook of both of them in a way that seemed to operate at a considerably louder volume than either, which James, now 3, regarded with the uncertain interest of a child being introduced to a significant rearrangement of his world. He adjusted. By summer he was thoroughly devoted to her, in the solemn proprietary way of a firstborn who has decided that the new arrival is not a threat but a dependent. Clark watched his children in the yard that summer, James serious and protective and Clara radically indifferent to her brother's concern, and felt the particular, complicated fullness of a life that had arrived at a place of abundance that he had not known how to imagine when he was younger. He had not been a man who let himself want things. The mountains had suited him partly because they demanded everything you could give and gave back honest difficulty and real beauty and a certain uncomplicated relationship with what mattered, and he had spent years equating that clarity with the life he was supposed to be living. But this was clearer still. This was the clearest thing he had ever known. Chet Mallory died in the fall of 1887, quietly in his sleep, which was the best possible way, and which Ada said she thanked God for. Helen and Clark were with Ada through the funeral and the weeks that followed, and it was Helen who suggested that Ada come to live in the room they had been using as a storeroom, which could be cleared and made comfortable, and Ada who said she was too old and set in her ways to be a boarder and too fond of her own house to leave it. But she came for supper twice a week after that, and the arrangement that developed was one of mutual care that suited all of them, and that meant none of them had to say directly what they were doing, which was looking after each other. The spring of 1888 brought a man to Durango from the Colorado Land Office, who was trying to consolidate some of the smaller homesteads in the Eastern District for a cattle corporation from Denver, and who knocked on the door of Helen and Clark's homestead one Tuesday morning with a stack of papers and an offer that was considerably below what the land was worth. Helen sat across the table from him in the kitchen and listened to the offer with her hands folded and her expression entirely neutral, and when he was finished she told him, in plain and specific terms, that she was not interested and that he should note in his report that the land was improved and productive and that the owners intended to stay. The man looked at Clark when she finished, which was a mistake. Clark said, with a calm that Helen recognized as absolute, "I think she said no." The man left. He did not come back. The Denver Corporation found other land to consolidate. Clark put the kettle on after the man's wagon was out of the yard and Helen sat at the table, and there was a moment of quiet between them that was partly the aftermath of something unpleasant and partly the satisfaction of having dealt with it directly. 40 acres, Clark said. 40 acres, she agreed. And then with a small smile, and worth more than he offered. Considerably, he said. She looked at him across the table with the expression she sometimes wore when she was about to say something important, the one that had prefaced their first real conversation and her proposal and the news of both children. He had learned to recognize it and to wait for it. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the east pasture, whether we have room to carry another 8 or 10 head if we extended the water supply through the dry months." He looked at her. "That was what you were going to say?" "Yes," she said. "Were you expecting something else?" He thought about everything she might have said, given the year they had built together, the life they were building, the children, the land, all the accumulated solidity of it. He thought about how she was still the most practical woman he had ever met, and how that practicality was, in her, inseparable from her love, the way she showed care by planning for the future, by extending the water supply for the next decade's cattle, by planting apple trees that would bear in 4 years, by saying "I want to know what your intentions are" at a fence post in December with the directness of a woman who believed in being clear about what mattered. "No," he said. "Tell me about the east pasture." She told him about the east pasture. He listened with the full attention he had been giving her words since the first morning at her kitchen table in November of 1882. The attention that came from understanding that she did not say unnecessary things, and that everything she said was worth hearing. James came in from outside while she was talking, trailing mud and the bright-eyed look of a child who has been doing something interesting, and Clara toddled behind him with her determined gait, and they came into the kitchen and required various things of their parents, and the conversation about the east pasture was interrupted and resumed, and finally completed over supper that evening on the porch, with the last of the summer light going red and gold across the mountains. Drum stood in the corral below the porch, his large head over the fence rail, his crooked ear turned toward the sound of voices in the way he always did. He was 9 years old and sound and gray around the muzzle now, still the ugliest horse in the county, still the most trustworthy. James had named the slightly sideways ear Alfred, a fact that neither Clark nor Helen had encouraged or discouraged, and which Drum appeared to have no opinion about. Helen looked at the horse from the porch, and Clark watched her look at him, and thought about the question he had asked her in the sale yard on that October afternoon 6 years ago. What do you see in him? He knew the answer now, had known it for years, the same thing she saw in everything she chose. Not the surface but the substance, not the appearance but the truth underneath it. She had looked at an ugly, mismatched laugh, at horse and seen steadiness and trustworthiness, and a fundamental reliability that the horse had then spent years proving correct. She had looked at a rough, solitary mountain man at a livestock sale and seen something worth stopping for. She had looked at a 40-acre homestead with a broken-down barn and a hard season ahead of her and seen a life worth building. This was what he had fallen in love with before he had words for it. Not simply the gray eyes or the direct voice or the warmth she kept slightly out of sight until you had earned it. It was this, the quality of her seeing. The willingness to look past what was easy and obvious to what was actually there. He reached across the porch bench and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the fading light, with the mountains going dark against the evening sky, and their children playing in the yard below and Drum standing at his fence with his improbable face, and his crooked ear, and all the patient steadiness that had brought the two of them together on an ordinary Saturday morning at a livestock sale in Durango, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882. The sky went dark and the stars came out, hard and brilliant above the San Juans, the same stars that had looked down on Clark in his mountain camp during all those solitary winters, the same stars that had looked down on Helen in her little house during the 18 months she had managed alone. But the stars were seeing something different now. They were seeing a porch light, amber in the dark. They were seeing two people side by side. They were seeing a home. James came up the porch steps with the particular urgency of a 4-year-old who has decided the day is not over yet, and Clara came behind him on her unsteady feet, and Helen scooped Clara up without standing, and Clark put his free arm around James, and the porch held all four of them in its small, warm circle of light. "Is it dark?" James asked, with the tone of someone who already knows the answer and is testing whether the answer has changed. "Very dark," Helen confirmed. "Alfred can see in the dark," James said, Alfred being Drum's ear. "I am not sure that is how ears work," Clark said. James considered this. "Papa," he said seriously, "I think you might be wrong about that." Helen made the sound that was her version of a laugh, the brief warm exhalation that he had been collecting since she first made it in the sale yard 6 years ago. He tipped his head against hers, briefly, the small everyday intimacy of people who have built a life together and know the weight of it and choose it every morning. "Maybe I am," Clark said, looking at his son's face, earnest and dark-eyed in the lamplight. "Alfred can probably see in the dark." James looked satisfied with this resolution, and climbed into Helen's lap alongside Clara, who had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder with the decisive abruptness of a small child who decides to stop being awake, and the four of them sat on the porch in the mountain dark while the stars turned slowly overhead, and the horses moved in the corral, and the apple trees in their young orchard stood in the darkness like a promise of something good still coming. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of what a life could be when you looked at things honestly and stayed with what was true, and it had started, as many of the best things do, with a single moment of paying attention. An ugly horse at a sale, a woman who raised her hand, a mountain man who needed to know what she saw in it, and when she told him, she had been telling him something that applied to everything, to the horse and to the land and to the future, and without knowing it yet to him. She had looked at the surface of things and seen past it to the steadiness underneath, and she had trusted what she saw, and she had been right. She was almost always right. He had learned to count on this. He held her hand on the porch in the dark and listened to the mountains and the horses and the quiet breathing of his sleeping daughter and the soft running commentary of his son, who was explaining to Drum across the yard that he should go to sleep now, but that Alfred was allowed to stay up, and he felt the weight and the warmth and the entirety of it, and he was grateful down to the bone. The night settled over the homestead like something deliberate. The fire inside needed tending. The morning would bring new work and new demands and the ongoing, beautiful labor of a life in the West, in the mountains, in the company of a woman who had known what she was looking at when she looked. Clark stood up, carefully transferring James, who was now also dozing, to his own arms, and Helen stood with Clara against her shoulder, and they went inside and the door closed behind them and the lamp was warm in the window. And outside in the corral Drum stood with his big ugly head angled toward the house and his crooked ear turned toward the sound of a family going to bed. And the mountains rose in the dark all around, patient and permanent and full of everything that was true about this country. Which was that it was hard and it was beautiful, and it rewarded, above everything, the willingness to look past the obvious to what was actually there.